Welcome to our deep dive today. Galileo, he's one of those figures in science, really iconic. But I wonder, have you ever thought about what it must have been like to be Galileo back in the 17th century, going up against centuries of accepted knowledge about the universe? That's what we're going to look at today, the Galileo affair.
Yeah, it's a story that people often kind of oversimplify, it's just science versus religion and that's it. But when you actually get into it, look at the actual documents, like the ones that are collected in the Galileo affair, a documentary history, you realize it's much more, I guess you could say, nuanced. It's definitely a more human story.
That's what I love about these deep dives.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get right into it. What was Galileo like as a person?
Yeah.
I mean, he wasn't just a name in a textbook, right?
Oh, right. Definitely not. I mean, brilliant, obviously. But he was also, quite a character, witty, argumentative, kind of a self-promoter even. Even as a university professor, he had money problems. He had to take on, side gigs to make ends meet.
Wow. It's kind of funny to imagine, right? This renowned genius hustling to pay the bills just like the rest of us.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have this, brilliant but struggling scientist. So let's set the scene. What was the prevailing view of the universe at the time?
Okay, so back then, the accepted model was geocentrism, which is, the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe and everything revolves around it. And this wasn't just some random idea. This was based on the work of people like Aristotle, Ptolemy, and it had, the Catholic Church was really behind it.
So Galileo comes along and challenges this really, really deeply ingrained worldview. I can see why some people might be upset.
Yeah.
But he didn't just, disagree, did he? He had scientific evidence to back up his claims.
Exactly. Galileo was making these observations with the telescope, which was a pretty new invention at the time. And what he saw through that telescope completely went against the geocentric model. But there's this other thing, too. There are actually some pretty solid scientific arguments against the idea of a heliocentric universe, so a universe with the sun at the center.
Oh, okay. Now I'm really curious. So what were these arguments?
Well, picture yourself standing on top of a tall tower, and you drop a ball. If the Earth is spinning, wouldn't you think that ball would land a little bit behind the tower? Because the Earth would have moved while the ball was falling. That's the tower argument.
Yeah. That makes sense. I never thought about it like that. What else?
There was also the cannonball argument. If the Earth is spinning eastward, then wouldn't a cannonball fired to the east travel farther than one fired to the west? Since it would have the Earth's rotation, giving it that extra push.
Okay, yeah, those are some pretty good arguments. I can see why people weren't, immediately convinced that the Earth was moving. So what did Galileo have to say about all this?
Well, Galileo, he was a master of observation and reasoning. He argued against those arguments by saying that, objects on Earth, they share in its motion. Think about it. If you jump up in the air, you don't suddenly land miles away, right? Because the Earth has rotated under you. You land in the same spot because you're moving with the Earth.
Oh, okay, I see. So the ball dropping from the tower wouldn't land behind it because the ball's also moving along with the Earth's rotation. Pretty clever. Did he have an answer to the cannonball thing, too?
Yeah, his explanation is a little complicated, but it basically comes down to the idea that the cannonball, doesn't matter which way you fire it, is also moving with the Earth's rotation.
Okay, so he was addressing these scientific questions head on. Was that enough to win everyone over?
Well, not quite. There was another big factor to consider. Religion.
Yeah, of course, the church. Now things are getting interesting.
Right. So the Roman Inquisition, they were the ones responsible for defending the church's teachings, and they were suspicious of anything that seemed to, contradict the Bible. And Galileo's ideas, they weren't just about stars and planets. They were challenging, humanity's place in God's creation.
Whoa. I can see how that would be a big deal. So were there certain parts of the Bible that people felt like contradicted Galileo's theories?
One of the biggest ones was a passage in the book of Joshua where God makes the sun stand still, so the Israelites could win a battle. And if you take that literally, it means the sun normally moves around the Earth. And that supports the whole geocentric view.
So how did Galileo try to, square his scientific findings with those biblical interpretations?
He argued that the Bible shouldn't be read as a science textbook. He said it was meant to teach moral and spiritual truths, not a literal account of how the physical world works.
That's a really interesting point. Was the church open to that argument?
Let's just say that Galileo's ideas were getting a lot of attention, and not all of it was good.
And that's where we get to the 1616 decree, right?
Yeah.
What was so important about that?
Yeah. So the 1616 decree, it was issued by the Congregation of the Index, and they were the ones who decided what books were okay for Catholics to read. And this decree said that the idea of a heliocentric universe, which is also called Copernicanism, was false and went against Scripture.
So it wasn't a direct order from the Inquisition, but it was a pretty clear message that the church was not happy with Galileo's theories.
Exactly. And after that, Galileo's ideas were officially on the church's radar, and this sets the stage for, well, a clash that's going to change the course of scientific history.
This is already so much more complicated than just like science versus religion, which is what you always hear.
Yeah.
I'm really interested to hear what happens next.
Well, that's where our deep dive continues. Next time, we'll look at the things that led up to Galileo's trial, including his book, Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems, which was pretty controversial.
Oh, I bet. Sounds like things are about to get even more interesting. Until then, keep thinking. Last time, we were talking about the 1616 decree, which basically told Galileo, hey, we're watching you. But Galileo, well, he wasn't going to just back down. He thought it was really important to share what he believed about the universe, you know?
Yeah, and that led him to write his most famous book, Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems. Pretty bold move, considering how the church felt about Copernicanism.
So what was this dialogue all about? Was it like a science textbook just laying out all his evidence?
Actually, he wrote it as a debate, a dialogue between three people. There's Salviati, he's the one who represents the Copernican view, and then there's Simplicio, who's defending the traditional geocentric model, and then there's this third guy, Segredo, he's like an intelligent layman, sort of a moderator between the two.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just Galileo lecturing everyone. It's more like a back and forth, looking at different perspectives. Was he trying to, maybe make the church less upset, make his ideas seem less threatening?
It's hard to know for sure, but the way he wrote the dialogue and some of the things he said, well, it actually caused more trouble.
I bet. So what did the Inquisition find so objectionable about it?
Well, for one thing, they thought Galileo wasn't really being fair to both sides, even though he said he was neutral. They pointed to parts where Salviati, the Copernican guy, seemed to be outsmarting Simplicio, making the traditional view look, well, kind of silly.
Ah, so it wasn't just what Galileo was saying, it was how he was saying it. The dialogue itself was part of the problem.
Right. The Inquisition thought he was promoting Copernicanism, which they already said was heretical. And they also didn't like some specific things. Like, Galileo praised William Gilbert, who was an English scientist who believed in the heliocentric universe.
So by praising Gilbert, it was like Galileo was saying he agreed with him. And the church thought that was dangerous. Was there anything else they used against him?
They focused on a part where Galileo, speaking of Salviati, says he's more desirous of glory than is suitable. They thought that meant Galileo cared more about being famous than about obeying the church.
Oof. It's not good. Anything else?
There was also this weird thing where Galileo offered to add 2 more days to his dialogue. But in those 2 days, he would refute all the arguments he had just made for the Copernican theory.
Wait, what? He offered to argue against himself. Why would he do that?
It does seem strange. Maybe he was trying to show he was being objective, looking at both sides. But the Inquisition thought it meant he wasn't being sincere. They were like, if you think the Copernican theory is wrong, why did you write so convincingly about it in the first place?
Sounds like they had already decided he was guilty and were just looking for proof.
Yeah, who knows what they were thinking. But there's no doubt they saw Galileo's dialogue as a threat to their authority. They weren't going to let him get away with it.
So the trial was basically a done deal.
In a lot of ways, yeah. But this wasn't just about Galileo and his ideas. It was part of something much bigger that was happening all over Europe.
What do you mean?
The rise of modern science, with all the focus on observation and experiments. This was challenging a lot of long-held beliefs. The telescope, the thing Galileo used to make his discoveries, that was a symbol of this new way of thinking.
So Galileo was right in the middle of this huge cultural change, pushing boundaries. And that led to conflict with the people in power.
That's a good way to put it. It was a clash between old and new, between traditional authority and the power of scientific inquiry.
Okay, so we've got this cultural upheaval going on. Tell me about the trial itself. What happened?
Galileo got to Rome in February 1633. He had tried to postpone the trial, because he was getting sick, but it didn't work. He was interrogated a bunch of times by the Inquisition, and he tried to defend himself, but it was pretty hopeless.
Did he say he hadn't broken the rules of the 1616 decree?
He did. He said that in the dialogue, he had presented both sides equally and hadn't actually said he believed in Copernicanism.
But they didn't buy it.
Nope. They thought it was obvious that the dialogue favored the Copernican view. And to make things worse, they brought out this document, supposedly from a meeting back in 1616 where Galileo was specifically told not to teach Copernicanism in any way whatsoever.
Wow, so they basically changed the rules.
Yeah, I mean, nobody knows for sure if that document was real or if they just made it up to use against Galileo.
So what could he do?
He could be tortured and imprisoned, or he could take back what he said, and in the end, that's what he did.
What did that involve?
So on June 22, 1633, Galileo had to kneel in front of the Inquisition and read a statement. And in that statement, he said he didn't believe in the Earth's motion and that the Copernican theory was wrong.
That must have been awful for him, to have to say something he didn't believe.
It was a big moment, both for Galileo and for science in general. But even when he recanted, there's this story that he whispered under his breath, "Eppur si muove," which means, "and yet it moves."
Wow, even when he was defeated, he still held on to his belief.
Exactly. The Galileo affair was about more than just winning or losing an argument. It was about the search for truth, the bravery to challenge authority, and how powerful ideas can be.
Okay, so we've seen how the trial happened, the arguments they used, and the final result. Galileo was forced to recant, but the story doesn't end there, right?
Definitely not. What happened with Galileo had a big impact that went way beyond the Inquisition. It changed the relationship between science and religion, and it still makes us think about how we search for knowledge and who has the authority to decide what's true.
This has been such an amazing deep dive. I can't wait to hear what happened after the trial and what we can learn from Galileo's story all these years later.
That's exactly what we're going to talk about in the last part.
Awesome. Stay tuned. There's still more to come. Welcome back. So we've been talking about the Galileo affair, his discoveries, the trial, him having to say he was wrong. But what happened after that? I mean, was that it for Galileo?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, he was punished, yeah. He was put under house arrest for the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't completely silence him.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't like straight to a dungeon, never to be heard from again.
No, he had to stay at his villa in Arcetri, which is near Florence. But he could have visitors, he could write letters to his colleagues, and he could keep studying. Under supervision, of course.
Well, that's something at least. So did he keep making scientific discoveries, even stuck at home?
He did. It's pretty amazing, actually. During that time, he wrote what some people consider his most important work. It's called Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Relating to Two New Sciences.
Wow.
It came out in 1638. And that book, it basically laid the foundation for what we now call classical mechanics. And get this, by this time he was almost blind, but he was still coming up with these amazing ideas.
Wow, that's incredible. What kind of groundbreaking stuff was he working on in that book?
Oh, he was looking at things like motion, acceleration, gravity, the basic principles that Isaac Newton would later build on.
So even though he was under house arrest, Galileo's work had a huge impact on the future of science. It's pretty amazing how he could still do so much, even when things were so hard for him.
It really shows how passionate he was about figuring out how the world works. The Galileo affair, it was a setback, for sure, but it didn't stop him from wanting to understand the universe.
Yeah. People often talk about the Galileo affair as an example of how dangerous it is to have strict beliefs and to try to shut down science. But it's obviously a lot more complicated than that, right?
Right. It wasn't just, science versus religion. It was like these two different ways of seeing the world crashing into each other. The old ways of thinking and then this new way of looking at things, using observation and logic. And Galileo was stuck in the middle of it all.
So looking back on the Galileo affair, centuries later, what are some of the big things we can take away from it? What can we learn from Galileo?
Well, one thing that really stands out to me is how important critical thinking is, questioning what you believe and challenging the way things are. Galileo was willing to look past what everyone else thought and just follow the evidence, even when it meant going up against these really powerful institutions.
And it also shows how important it is to be curious and to just want to learn things, right? Even when people are against you, even when things are hard, Galileo never stopped trying to understand things. It's like he's reminding us that trying to find the truth can be a really long and difficult journey, but it's still worth it.
Exactly. And his story also makes us think about how science and religion interact. They don't always get along, but it's important to try to understand both of them and how they relate to each other.
It's pretty amazing how, Even hundreds of years later, Galileo's stories still mean something to us today. It's about our own struggles to figure out the world, to find our place in the universe, and to deal with these big questions about what's true, who's in charge, and what are the limits of what we can know.
Yeah, I think that's what makes these deep dives so interesting. They connect us to the past, but they also help us understand the present. And they encourage us to keep asking questions, to keep learning, and to keep looking for a better understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Well said. This has been an incredible journey through the Galileo affair. I've learned so much. Thanks for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, keep those minds working. Until next time, keep exploring.